The first thing that made my stomach drop wasn't seeing someone on my property. It was hearing my electric meter screaming like it wanted to tear itself off the wall. Up in the Blue Elk Mountains, silence is supposed to have weight, the kind that settles over the pines after sunrise, but that morning, the only thing cutting through the air was the frantic whir of a meter spinning so fast it sounded like a turbine. Then I looked up at my cabin and froze. Every porch light was blazing. The kitchen glowed through the front windows, and I hadn't been there in almost 3 weeks. My name is Nathan Brooks, and if someone had told me that one orange extension cord would uncover months of theft, lies, intimidation, and eventually put an entire family under criminal investigation, I probably would have laughed. Looking back now, I wish I'd laughed a little longer. My cabin wasn't some luxury vacation home. It was a place my grandfather and I rebuilt together after an old forest fire had left little more than a stone chimney standing. Every floorboard carried a memory. Every beam had passed through our hands before it reached the ceiling. After Grandpa passed away, that little cabin became the only place where my thoughts ever slowed down. I worked as an electrical systems consultant in Spokane, spending most of my weeks crawling through commercial buildings and solving problems no one else wanted to touch. The cabin was my reset button. No neighbors close enough to borrow sugar. No traffic. Just trees, deer, and enough quiet to hear your own heartbeat. At least that's how it used to be. I parked beside the shed, grabbed my backpack, and kept staring at the meter. I'd installed that digital unit myself 2 years earlier. I knew exactly what normal consumption looked like. This wasn't normal. This was industrial. I unlocked the front door, expecting maybe a burst pipe, some forgotten heater, anything that made sense. Everything inside was exactly the way I'd left it. The refrigerator hummed quietly. Every switch was on. The coffee maker was hot. Even the porch heater was running. Someone had deliberately powered up everything they could find. I shut the breakers off one by one until the cabin finally went dark. Outside, though, the meter kept spinning. That was impossible. Unless I walked around the side of the porch. And there it was. A thick orange contractor-grade extension cord disappeared beneath the railing, plugged neatly into an outdoor outlet I'd installed myself. It stretched downhill, weaving through bushes before disappearing into the woods. I actually laughed once, not because it was funny, because it was so unbelievably bold that my brain rejected it for a second. Someone wasn't stealing electricity by accident. They built themselves a private power line using my cabin as the source. I followed the cord about 50 yards before voices interrupted me. "Hey, what exactly do you think you're doing?" A woman stormed out from behind a cluster of fir trees carrying a pair of pruning shears like they were some kind of badge of authority. She was probably in her late 50s, dressed in expensive hiking clothes that somehow still looked brand new. Oversized sunglasses covering half her face despite the clouds. "You're trespassing," she snapped. I looked down at the cord in my hand, then back at her. "This cord is plugged into my outlet." "That's community infrastructure," she shot back without missing a beat. "Actually," I said, "it's attached to my house." She folded her arms. "You've been taking electricity that belongs to everyone." I honestly thought she was joking. "Ma'am, your extension cord is literally in my hand." "Put it down." "No, you're interfering with shared utilities." I remember blinking because nothing she said connected to reality. Shared utilities? This cabin isn't connected to any neighborhood system. She took one step closer, pointed a finger toward my chest, and said, "People like you always think owning land means you own everything around it." There it was, the real issue. It wasn't electricity. It was resentment. Later, I'd learn her name was Denise Holloway, and she'd spent years convincing newer residents that the old cabins scattered around the mountain somehow benefited from services everyone else paid for. None of it was true, but she'd repeated it enough that some people stopped asking questions. I pulled my phone out and started recording. "Can you explain why your extension cord is plugged into my outlet?" She immediately turned away. "Stop filming me. Answer the question. You're harassing me. You walked onto my property. I'm protecting the neighborhood." Then, before I could say another word, she pulled out her own phone. I figured she'd call her husband, maybe another neighbor. Instead, she dialed 911. I listened in disbelief as she practically screamed into the phone. "There's a man stealing community electricity and threatening me. He's trying to destroy shared utilities." I actually looked behind me to see if someone else was standing there. She was describing a completely different person. 20 minutes later, 2 sheriff's deputies rolled up the gravel road. Denise sprinted toward them, crying before either deputy had even stepped out of the vehicle. She pointed at me like she'd just survived some hostage situation. Deputy Aaron Mills looked at me, then at the orange extension cord still lying across my boots, then back at Denise, whose performance deserved an award if facts hadn't mattered quite so much. I took one slow breath and realized something important. This wasn't going to end with a simple conversation. Someone had been stealing from me for months, and the person responsible had just invited law enforcement to the scene herself. Maybe that would turn out to be the biggest mistake she'd ever make. Deputy Mills didn't say much at first, and that was probably the smartest thing anyone did all morning. While Denise kept talking over everyone, insisting I had somehow hijacked community power, he simply walked over to the outlet on my porch, crouched down, and traced the orange extension cord with his eyes before looking up at me. "Mind if I follow this?" he asked. "Please do," I said. Denise immediately jumped in. "He's tampering with evidence." Mills didn't even acknowledge her. His partner, Deputy Lisa Hernandez, stayed behind with us while Mills followed the cord downhill into the trees. Denise kept trying to fill the silence with accusations. According to her, I'd been difficult ever since I bought the cabin. I'd refused to participate in neighborhood projects. I'd acted like I was better than everyone else. The funny part was, I'd barely met half the people who lived within 5 miles. I came up here to avoid drama, not create it. Hernandez finally asked, "How often are you here?" "Maybe 2 weekends a month." "Anyone else have access to your property?" "No." "Have you noticed unusually high electric bills?" I laughed quietly. "Actually, yes. I blame the refrigerator, then the security cameras, then maybe a bad meter. I even replaced a water heater last winter because I thought it was drawing too much current." My smile faded. Turns out I wasn't fixing the problem. I was paying for someone else's lifestyle. About 10 minutes later, Mills radioed in. "You both need to come see this." We followed him nearly 200 yards through the woods until the extension cord reached a clearing I'd never had any reason to visit. Hidden beneath a collection of camouflage tarps sat what looked like a makeshift outdoor workshop. Portable freezers, floodlights, power tools, 2 electric heaters, a chest refrigerator, several battery chargers. Every single one of them connected to power strips branching off my extension cord like the roots of some invasive plant. Mills stared for several seconds before saying, "Well, that's definitely not standard extension cord usage." Denise suddenly looked far less confident. "Those aren't mine." Mills pointed toward a folding chair with a coffee mug sitting beside it. The mug had floral lettering, Denise's initials, D.H. Hernandez walked toward a storage bin and found bags of gardening supplies, fertilizer, expensive landscaping equipment, and several receipts addressed to Denise Holloway. "Still not yours?" Hernandez asked. Denise folded her arms. "Someone planted those." I almost admired the commitment. Almost. Mills turned to me. "Mr. Brooks, approximately how long has this outlet been accessible?" "Always." "How long have your electric bills been unusually high?" "At least 6 months." Mills nodded slowly, then photographed everything. Denise kept talking, each explanation somehow making less sense than the one before it. First, the equipment belonged to a volunteer gardening group. Then it belonged to a cousin. Then she claimed everyone shared electricity in the mountains because that's how rural communities worked. Even Hernandez couldn't hide a smile at that one. "Ma'am," she said carefully, "I've worked rural communities for 12 years. I've never seen anyone run 200 yards of extension cord into someone else's property and call it sharing." By noon, representatives from the electric cooperative had arrived. One technician named Calvin removed the outlet cover from my porch and frowned almost immediately. "Interesting." "What?" I asked. He held up the wiring. "These terminals have been disconnected and reattached multiple times." Meaning somebody's been inside this box. I hadn't opened it since I installed it. Calvin continued tracing the cable, discovering homemade splice points buried beneath leaves and rocks. Whoever had done this knew enough about electricity to be dangerous, but not enough to do it legally. One bad rainstorm and someone could have been electrocuted. That realization hit me harder than the stolen money. It wasn't just theft anymore. Someone had turned my property into a fire hazard without me ever knowing. News spreads faster than wind in mountain communities. By early afternoon, a few nearby cabin owners wandered over after spotting sheriff vehicles parked outside my place. An older man named Walter Jensen listened quietly while deputies explained what they'd found. Then his eyebrows lifted. "Wait, you said hidden extension cords?" Mills nodded. Walter's face changed. "Last fall, my power bill tripled. Utility company couldn't explain it. Another couple looked at each other. Ours too. Then another voice. Same here. Within an hour, what had started as my complaint became something much bigger. Deputies began visiting neighboring properties, and by sunset they'd located 3 more illegal power lines running through dense woods toward different structures. Different colors, different routes, same method. Every one of them disappeared somewhere near land connected to Denise's extended family. It turned out she hadn't simply stolen electricity from me. She'd apparently built an entire unofficial power network across private properties, convincing relatives they were entitled to use whatever they could access because, in her words, outsiders already had enough. I couldn't stop thinking about that sentence. Outsiders. My grandfather built that cabin nearly 40 years before Denise even moved into the county. Somehow, I was the outsider. The investigation continued over the next several days. Detectives interviewed residents. Utility workers compared billing histories. Engineers measured power loads. The numbers became staggering. Thousands of dollars in electricity had disappeared over several seasons. But the financial loss wasn't what shocked investigators most. It was the planning. Buried conduit. Carefully hidden junction boxes. Vegetation trimmed just enough to conceal cables while keeping them accessible for repairs. This wasn't impulsive. Someone had invested serious time creating the system. Denise, meanwhile, doubled down. Also, she posted online claiming she was being persecuted by wealthy landowners. She accused deputies of corruption. She even claimed I'd fabricated evidence because I worked with electrical systems professionally. Of course he knows how to fake wiring. She told anyone willing to listen. The irony nearly made me laugh. If I'd wanted to fake evidence, I certainly wouldn't have invited law enforcement to inspect every inch of my property. Then something happened that changed the entire atmosphere. I returned to the cabin one Friday evening after meeting with investigators in town. My motion lights were off. Strange, because I'd replaced every bulb 2 days earlier. As I walked toward the porch, I noticed muddy boot prints across the wooden steps. Big prints, far larger than Denise's shoes. My front door hadn't been forced open, but someone had stood there long enough to leave cigarette ashes scattered across the welcome mat. One of my security cameras had been turned completely backward, not broken, just rotated so it pointed at the sky. Whoever had done it wanted me to know they could reach my cabin whenever they pleased. I downloaded footage from the remaining cameras. Around 2017 that morning, a tall man wearing a hood walked into frame carrying a flashlight. His face never became fully visible, but the way he moved told me he wasn't lost. He walked directly to each camera, checking angles before turning one away. Then he stood on the porch for nearly 3 minutes, staring through my living room window. He never tried entering. He simply watched. The sheriff identified him 2 days later. His name was Curtis Holloway, Denise's older brother. Unlike Denise, Curtis wasn't interested in arguments. He preferred intimidation. According to investigators, he'd already accumulated several assault complaints over the years. The witnesses often backed away before charges stuck. Suddenly, everything made sense. Denise played the victim in daylight. Curtis handled the fear after dark. The sheriff increased patrols around my road, and neighbors started checking on each other more often. It should have made me feel safer. Instead, every sound outside the cabin after sunset felt different. Every snapping branch made me glance toward the windows. I wasn't afraid of a confrontation. I was worried about what desperate people might do after realizing their entire operation was beginning to collapse. And as it turned out, desperation was exactly what came next. 3 nights later, everything finally came to a head. And oddly enough, it wasn't because I went looking for Curtis or Denise. They came looking for me. I just finished securing a new lock on the equipment shed when headlights rolled slowly up the gravel road. A pickup stopped about 30 yards from the porch. Curtis climbed out first. Denise followed, arms folded, wearing that same expression she'd had the day deputies arrived. The look of someone who genuinely believed reality should bend to whatever story she happened to be telling. Curtis didn't yell. Somehow that made him more unsettling. He walked halfway across the yard and said, "You could have handled this like neighbors." I couldn't help smiling. Running extension cords into my house for 6 months was your version of being neighborly? Denise immediately jumped in. You ruined this community over a little electricity. No, I replied quietly. I just unplugged one extension cord. Everything else unraveled on its own. Before either of them could answer, another pair of headlights appeared behind the truck. Then another. Sheriff Daniel Mercer stepped out of the first SUV with 2 investigators and a utility inspector. They hadn't come because I called. They'd come because search warrants had finally been approved that afternoon. Curtis looked over his shoulder, and for the first time since I'd met him, his confidence cracked. Deputies executed the warrants simultaneously across several properties connected to the Holloway family. By sunrise, they had recovered stolen equipment, illegally modified electrical hardware, buried junction boxes, utility records, and enough physical evidence to map out the entire unauthorized power network. Investigators later explained that what looked like a handful of extension cords had actually evolved into an organized theft operation spanning multiple seasons. Denise kept insisting everyone had misunderstood her intentions, but intentions don't erase wiring diagrams, purchase receipts, surveillance footage, or fingerprints. Curtis tried blaming contractors who had supposedly disappeared years earlier. That story lasted about 10 minutes before detectives showed him photographs, placing him at several splice locations over different dates. Watching the two of them realize there was no explanation left was strangely quiet. No dramatic confession, no movie speech. Just two people slowly understanding that every shortcut they'd taken had finally reached its destination. Months later, the court ordered restitution to every verified victim. My reimbursement covered the stolen electricity, damaged equipment, safety inspections, and repairs. But honestly, the money wasn't what stayed with me. What stayed with me was standing on my porch after everyone had left, listening to something I hadn't noticed in a very long time. Silence, real silence. No overloaded meter. No hidden cables humming beneath leaves. No wondering whether another stranger would walk out of the trees. Just wind moving through old pine branches exactly the way Grandpa used to describe it. Before he passed away, he once told me, character isn't measured by how people treat you when everything's easy. It's measured by what you refuse to become after someone treats you unfairly. I didn't fully understand that until this happened. There were moments I wanted revenge. Moments I wanted to embarrass Denise publicly, or answer Curtis's intimidation with anger of my own. But the truth is, evidence accomplished everything rage never could. Facts don't need to shout. They simply wait until every lie runs out of places to hide. I still spend weekends at the cabin. The sheriff occasionally stops by just to say hello if he's patrolling nearby. Walter brings fresh trout whenever fishing is good. A few neighbors I barely knew before all this now wave whenever they pass the road. Funny how one person's greed ended up introducing me to the decent people who'd been there all along. As for Denise, some folks say she still insists she was treated unfairly. Maybe she believes that. Maybe telling the same story often enough eventually makes it feel true. But every time I walk past that porch outlet, I remember something much simpler. The day she called the police expecting me to be the one in trouble was the exact moment her entire scheme began falling apart. She thought the badge would protect her version of events. Instead, it protected the truth. Now I'm curious what you think. If someone had been stealing from you for months and then called the police trying to frame you, would you have stayed as calm as I did? Or would you have handled that confrontation differently? Let me know down in the comments because I genuinely like to hear where you draw the line between patience and pushing back. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like the video, subscribe for more true community conflict stories every week, and share this with someone who always says the truth eventually comes out. Sometimes, all it takes is one extension cord.